This is the second week? Yeah, second week of Lent. Is that right? It doesn't matter. Oh, you're still back here. Oh my gosh, I had no idea. Oh my God. Thank you, reassuring voice behind me. Lord. Second week of Lent, here we are. Lent is a season in which we create space to encounter God. We do this by giving up or taking up giving up things that distract us to create space for us to hear and respond to God, and taking up practices in place of those things that we've given up to ground us and realign us. Our prayer every Lent is that together as a community from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday, we'll be more intentional in creating space and encountering the divine. This year, we specifically are engaging Lent through the lens of finding rest for our souls, based on what Jesus says in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We've been spending Lent talking about things that prevent us from resting, because those tend to be things that also prevent us from connecting to God. And last week, we talked about perfectionism. And in writing the talk last week, I shared this on perfectionism. I was convicted about how much this is a part of my life. But that has only continued in the days since we last met. Just yesterday, I was talking to my counselor. I've been seeing a counselor for, a month and a half or so, trying to sort through some depression-like things that I am dealing with. And he asked me a question that I was not prepared to answer. He said, "What do you do to feel good? What do you do for fun?" And I sat there in silence for a long time, trying to think of what do I do for fun. And I rattled off a couple of things, and we talked about them for a little while. And then he said, I've noticed something, that all of the things that you mentioned are like working, or like, doing something, or like fixing something. And I was like, I've recently discovered that rediscovered, I should say, how much I tie my value and sense of worth into achieving and like producing. So we talked about that a little bit, and I was really struck by I had not come up with a single thing that I do for fun that didn't involve being productive. And I said out loud, I'm wondering why, in my mind, being unproductive is so bad. And he was like, "That's an interesting word to choose for that. What's another word for being unproductive?" I was like, "Well, I could think of 4: lazy, useless." And he was like, "Well, what about rest?" And I just started laughing. I was like, "Oh, yeah, I should not be teaching." I told him, we're doing this series and it's really good timing. And he laughed about that also. But all that to say, I'm very much in this with you in the things that we were talking about. And that is no different. Last week, perfectionism. This week, worry. We're talking about worry or anxiety, which will just be a whole new fun thing for me to discover this whole week. I've said this a few times before. I'm a planner. I'm constantly looking ahead to what's next, so much so that I often live in the future. I've said this before. I like to have an idea of what the month looks like before it even starts. I keep a very accurate and detailed and OCD calendar. And every week I start out the week on Sunday morning by writing out everything that I have to do that week. And as I finish each thing, I check it off and cross it out because it feels good to do both. And that just helps me feel prepared, and it keeps me from getting overwhelmed with just everything that goes on, keeps things from falling through the cracks. When I was in undergrad and grad school, the first thing I did in every class was, as soon as I got the syllabus, I put every date that I needed to be aware of in my calendar. I was that guy. I like being prepared. I hate being caught off guard. I realize this series is probably just going to be me doing a really bad job of marketing myself. Last week, I was just, I'm a perfectionist and control freak. This week, I'm just anxious, worrier, prepared guy. I just sound like a ton of fun to be around. Anyway, you're accepted here just as you are. A recurring nightmare, I've shared this again in the past, that I have. That sounds too extreme, but it is a recurring nightmare. I'm suddenly back in high school and it's finals week, and I suddenly remember that I have not gone to a class for the entire semester, and it's finals day, and I show up and like I don't even understand the questions that I'm reading on the test because I'm completely unprepared for it. That's kind of a hilarious scenario because I'm such a preparer and such a worrier that it never even came close to ever happening in real life. And I never had this dream when I was in school. It's only since I've been out of school that I have it all the time. And the cool new trick that my brain has played is instead of now being just showing up back at high school, it will be here. It'll be a Tuesday night, and I show up and realize that I haven't prepared anything, and it's time for me to speak, and I get up and just like stare and apologize a lot. These kinds of like recurring nightmare-ish dreams are common scenarios for people who are planners like me, people who are worried about being unprepared. Planners are worried people. Planning, to the extent that I sometimes do it, is just a worrying way to, worrying is just coping by attempting to control something beyond my control. Which, you know, can sometimes be a good thing, but when it gets to the point where it is taking over your life, worrying ends up just being an addiction to thought patterns. Thought patterns that in the moment help us feel in control of things that are outside of our control. But in the long term, those thought patterns actually only add more worry and more anxiety while robbing us of rest and connection to God. And there's plenty to worry about right now, right? Plenty of things to worry about that are far outside of my control. There's Russia and Ukraine still. There's China doing weird stuff. There's Israel and Gaza and the whole Middle East. There's shootings here. There's corruption that we're finding new depths to all the time. We have issues at the border. There's inflation and bank collapses and recession and depression and economic uncertainty. You may or may not have heard there's this tiny little election coming up near the end of the year. It's a lot. I simply don't know what the future looks like right now, it feels like. And the truth is, we never do. We never actually do. Sometimes we're just more aware of it, of how unknown the future always is. But none of us actually know with any certainty what the future looks like at any point in our lives. I think we can anticipate what the future looks like, so we can make educated assumptions and guesses and plans and fill up our calendar with way too much information. But the chaos of institutional collapse or war or pandemics happen. And when that happens, we're confronted with the truth that we never actually know what the future is going to look like. I think maybe in the years since COVID, we seem to be more accurately aware of this or acutely aware of it. Around this time last year, I shared Wall Street Journal had a poll that came out that showed for maybe the first time in history, most Americans doubt that their children will be better off than they were, which is sort of like one of the fabric of the American culture, the American dream, like your kids will be have things better than you will, seems to no longer be true. And stories and polls alluding to this sort of thing seem to always pop up when we're collectively aware of how uncertain the future is or when it's shrouded in anxiety. Living in this space, painfully aware of how uncertain the future is, can leave us exhausted and demoralized and riddled with anxiety. And all that serves to do is rob us from a lot from us, our health, but certainly our ability to rest and often our ability to trust God. Maybe that's where you're at tonight. I certainly don't think I'm alone in my worrying, but maybe you also are spiraling in the uncertainty and anxiety of life with questions like, how can I keep my kids safe? Or will I be able to provide for myself or my family? How will I get through the loss of a job or a loved one or a sense of security? Will we be okay? I think at times when everything feels uncertain and anxious or even bleak and we're tempted to just worry about it all, it's important for us to remember and focus on what we do know and how we can respond in the moment. I think Jesus invites us to do just that in this section of the Sermon of the Mount that we're looking at tonight. This is from Matthew 6, verses 25 through 34. He says, "If you decide for God, living a life of God worship, it follows that you don't fuss about what's on the table at mealtimes or whether the clothes in your closet are in fashion. There's far more to your life than the food you put in your stomach, more to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Look at the birds, free and unfettered, not tied down to a job description, careless in the care of God. And you count far more to him than birds. Has anyone by fussing in front of the mirror ever gotten taller by so much as an inch? All this time and money wasted on fashion, do you think it makes that much difference? Instead of looking at the fashions, walk out into the fields and look at the wildflowers. They never primp or shop, but have you ever seen color and design quite like it? The 10 best dressed men and women in the country look shabby alongside them. If God gives such attention to the appearance of wildflowers, most of which are never even seen, don't you think he'll attend to you, take pride in you, do his best for you? What I'm trying to do here is get you to relax, to not be so preoccupied with getting so you can respond to God's giving. People who don't know God and the way that he works fuss over these things, but you know both God and how he works. Steep your life in God reality, God initiative, God provisions. Don't worry about missing out. You'll find all your everyday human concerns will be met. And then he ends with this beautiful line. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now, and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. Now, obviously, there's a lot that we could talk about in that passage. And my tendency is to want to get in there and dissect everything and talk about each beautiful, interesting thing. But we're not going to pull this apart too much tonight. I don't want us to get lost in the weeds. I want us to see that in this section, in the face of worry, Jesus is inviting us to remember what's important. That being what we do know and how we can respond. What do we know based on this passage? That we are loved. You may have recognized some of Jesus' words here. They're a song that we sing a lot here that we're going to sing later tonight called Your Love is Strong is based on this passage. Jesus says, look at the birds, they're fed. Look at the flowers, they're beautifully designed and clothed. You're infinitely more important to and more loved by God than either birds or flowers. So even when things are so uncertain and so dire that you're worrying about the basic necessities like food or clothing, you can anchor yourself to the truth that the source and sustainer of the cosmos, this perfect and powerful ground of all being that we call God, love itself loves you and wants good and beautiful things for you. And all you have to do is look around to nature to see that truth. That's what we know. How then can we respond? Verse 34 again, he says, give your entire attention to what God is doing right now and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. Or as the NIV puts it, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus here is inviting us to stay awake and engaged by staying present in today. To stop living in the uncertainty and unknown of tomorrow, to start paying full attention to what is going on right in front of you right now. Stop living in the tyranny of an unknowable future and live in the simple freedom of the present. Your job is to handle today. Take it a day at a time. That's really all we can do. It's so simple, but I think that's what we need when worry enters our lives and things get so complicated and overwhelming and uncertain. You are loved. Pay attention to what is right in front of you today. These two things never change, regardless of our circumstances. Whether we can, with any certainty, anticipate the future, or whether things are completely uncertain and shaky, we can always come back to these two things. We are loved. Pay attention to what God is doing right in front of you today. Staying grounded in these two things isn't easy. I mean, I don't have to tell you that, especially when we're so aware of how uncertain the future is. It's way easier to get caught up in what's wrong than what's good and beautiful. It's way easier to be consumed with worries for tomorrow, than it is to stay present here and now today. But there are things that we can do to help make it a little bit easier on ourselves, to help us become aware of what God is up to help us live more in the present and less in the unknowable future, to help us let go of worry and find rest for our souls. So let's talk about a few of those. But before I get into them, I really want to say that I'm not standing in front of you suggesting that any of these things are a magic wand or an instant fix for the real scary and dark and burdensome aspects of our lives sometimes. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to minimize anyone's experience by giving very churchy sounding answers to complicated problems. The things that we're going to talk about are a way to push into God in the midst of uncertainty and worry and fear, to navigate life and all that comes with it, with God on our side. None of these are quick fixes, and they all take time to learn to do and time to see the positive effects of. Also, some of these, if not all of them, seem very obvious, to the point of being like infantile. I think that's part of the nefarious nature of what's going on here when we get consumed with worry. When we see these things that we're going to talk about, they seem so obvious that we think, duh, like, why are you even telling me that? But then we fail to implement them when we actually need them. And worry is one of those things that gets so complicated and convoluted. Often what we need in those moments is something really, really simple to help us practice letting go of worry. So the first practice that we can get into to let go of worry. Oh, good. I thought maybe Matt was still back there. Is to interrogate your worries. This is like just kind of a filter of questions that I run through when I can't get out of turning my brain off worrying about something. The first is, can I do anything about this? Valid question. If no, I've got to find a way to let it go. Like, if this is something that's truly beyond my control, I have to just figure out how to let that thing go. Either go and do something else, or one of the other things that we're going to talk about, just how I got to find a way to let it go if I really can't do anything about it. And it's interesting how often, if I think about, like, is this anything I can do anything about? And if the answer is no, how much that reduces my fear or anxiety or worry. It doesn't always go away, but it helps a lot. If I can do something about it, the next question is, can I do anything about it now? If not, again, I determine what that time frame is that I can do something about it. Like, I can worry about that when I get home, and then I let it go for now. And even giving it a mental space of, we'll get to that at the right time, helps get me out of that worry spiral. And then if the answer to, can I do anything about it now, is yes, then do it. Just do it and move on. That's the first practice. Another one is to practice Sabbath. Again, when we're talking about rest, this probably seems obvious, but when you're caught up in worry, rest feels like the exact opposite of what you need. But Sabbath, taking a Sabbath regularly throughout the week, has shown to reduce anxiety, to improve mental and physical health. And I think we can get caught up in all the complications of how to implement this in our lives, but I think I was reading a lot about this week, and I found someone's just very simple implementation of Sabbath that I really liked that I'm going to share with you. The first is, pick one day to be off of social media of any kind. Just be off of it completely for a day. On that day, pick a 3 to 4 hour block to start out with to be completely screen-free. Just get off your devices altogether. Get off TV, phones, computers, everything. And plan something or a couple of things that you want to do in that block that you enjoy. So, activities with your kids if you have kids. Go to the park or hike, go to a coffee shop. Have friends over for like a no pressure, like just snacks and drinks or something. Things that you might otherwise push out of your life, you now have this block of time to like, what do I want to do? Then maybe your counselor will ask you, what do you do for fun? And you can't come up with anything. And even if you just sit there for 3 or 4 hours, that's better. As you begin to do this over and over and over again, you will find that having space for a time to that you set aside to not worry and then also not engage with the things that tend to cause anxiety in our lives, social media being the biggest one, it begins to take less and less hold over your system. The key is to not overcomplicate Sabbath, to keep it simple so that you'll actually do it. And then I think it's important to keep in mind when you're engaging in this day, especially that 3 to 4 hour block, when worries come up, you can run them through that interrogation process, or you can just say, like, I'm not going to worry about that now. I'm in this window of time when I'm not going to worry about things. I'll worry about that later tonight or tomorrow or whenever. Again, giving it that mental space of, we'll come back to it at this time helps. The third thing, pray your worries. Paul writes in Philippians 4, don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. Now, this runs the risk of sounding just very, very churchy, right? Like, oh, if you're worried, pray. I don't tend to think about that in the moment because it sounds silly to some degree. And if that's you, I want you to keep in mind that the person who wrote this is a man who's gone through hell, who's currently sitting in jail, not sure if he's going to live or not, talking about how to deal with worry. A man who's probably not in the best health, who's probably on the verge of starvation, locked away in a prison cell, not sure if he's ever going to see any of his friends again, saying, instead of worrying, pray. I think he probably knows more. He certainly knows more than I do when it comes to legitimate things to worry about. So instead of just circling around on your worries, instead turn them to prayers to God to help you get them out of your mind and onto someone who you can trust with them. And then finally, practice gratitude. We talk about this often around here. Gratitude can sound like a silly antidote to the very real fears and worries of our lives. But gratitude isn't just, positive thinking. It isn't sticking your head in the sand and pretending like everything is good and only focusing on the good. But if worry is a significant part of your life, you probably have a hard time seeing the good things in your life. And being grateful and practicing gratitude is such an act of brave resistance and relentless persistence to foster an awareness of God's goodness in your life. Again, in the midst of very real struggles and suffering and fears and anxieties that come with life. And it's a very simple thing to implement. Practicing gratitude looks like intentionally thanking God as you come across things or people and experiences throughout your day, or journaling about them later. And if you want to also, especially if it's a person that you just are suddenly very grateful for, sending them a message and letting them know how much they mean to you. This practice does two things. It keeps you present in what is happening right now, what's right in front of you, and it helps you to start to notice and pay attention to what is good and beautiful in your life. It helps you notice and pay attention to just some of the ways that God is conveying his love to you. It helps you hold all of reality, not just the anxious things that you are worried about. Everything. So interrogate your worries, practice Sabbath, pray your worries, and practice gratitude. There are certainly more strategies to begin to give up worrying, but these are the 4 that I came up with this week. So let's just recap real quickly. Worrying is just an addiction. It's just an addiction to thought patterns that in the moment help you feel in control of things that are beyond your control. But in the long term, these thought patterns only add more worry and anxiety in our lives, which is sort of why it's like an addiction. It spirals you into the thing that you're doing to feel good, helps you feel good for a little bit, but that ultimately makes you feel worse. And so you do it again and again and again and again. You get stuck in that spiral, which robs you of rest and connection to God. So, in these moments when we're spiraling, in worry and anxiety, when all the complicated instability of life leaves us anxious and exhausted, when worry has begun to rob us of peace and rest for our souls, we can find an anchor point in Jesus' words that we read tonight, in the simplicity of remembering that we are loved. And by letting go of what we can't control, letting go of the worries of an anxious future, and instead staying present and engaged in what God is doing right in front of us, right now, today. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now, and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. Let's pray. God, it often feels difficult to trust you with the things that cause anxiety and dread and worry in my life. It is hard to trust you with an unknown future. God, I pray for me and for the people in this room that you will help me see the ways that this robs me of rest, that robs me of parts of my personality, that robs me of connection to you. God, I pray that we together can begin to learn to trust, to learn to give up worrying slowly but surely. And remembering that we are loved, and by focusing on what you've put right in front of us today. God, we love you. Amen.